It's 2 a.m. in Caracas, Venezuela. The capital is asleep. Then the sky lights up. Missiles strike military installations across the city. The power grid goes dark. All of Caracas blacked out. Flying just 100 feet above the Caribbean Sea, low enough to avoid radar, a fleet of American military helicopters closes in on the coast. On board, Delta Force operatives, their target, the most fortified compound in Venezuela. Inside that compound, a man who has ruled a country for over a decade is sleeping. He has no idea what's coming. 2 hours later, he is in handcuffs, on his way to a prison cell in Brooklyn, New York. His name is Nicolas Maduro, and this is how the United States carried out one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. To understand why the US flew Delta Force into Caracas in the dead of night, you have to understand Venezuela. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, 17% of the entire planet's supply. For decades, that made it one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. In 1999, a former military officer named Hugo Chavez took power. He was charismatic, anti-American, and wildly popular with the poor. He nationalized industries, spent oil money on social programs, and declared the United States an enemy. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, his chosen successor took over Nicolas Maduro, a former bus driver turned union leader turned politician. But Maduro was no Chavez. He lacked the charisma, and he inherited a country already starting to crack. Oil prices collapsed, the economy imploded, inflation hit 1,000,000%, supermarket shelves went empty. Millions of Venezuelans fled one of the largest refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere. And yet Maduro held on through election fraud, brutal crackdowns on protests, and the systematic jailing of political opponents. In the 2024 presidential election, independent monitors said Maduro clearly lost. He declared himself the winner anyway. The world largely refused to recognize him. The US had tried everything to remove him. Sanctions, diplomacy, a bounty first, $15 million, then $50 million. None of it worked. Until January 3rd, 2026. Here is what the US government says Maduro actually was, underneath all the politics. Not just a dictator, a drug lord. According to a 25-page federal indictment filed in the Southern District of New York, Maduro allegedly ran one of the largest cocaine trafficking operations on the planet beginning as far back as 1999. The indictment claims he gave drug traffickers diplomatic passports, that he partnered with cartels to ship thousands of tons of cocaine through the Caribbean and into the United States, that he oversaw a network of corrupt military officers all working to protect the trade. Prosecutors called it narco-terrorism, using drug money to fund political violence and destabilize the region. His wife, Cilia Flores, was charged as a co-conspirator. Maduro has denied everything. His team calls the charges politically motivated, a pretext for regime change. But the Trump administration used this indictment as the legal justification for the entire military operation. They didn't call it a war. They called it a law enforcement action. We didn't invade Venezuela, they said. We arrested a criminal. The rest of the world had a very different view. The operation didn't happen overnight. The CIA had been inside Venezuela for months before a single bomb dropped. Here is what we now know. The CIA inserted a team into Venezuela and recruited a source, someone operating close to Maduro himself, who fed real-time intelligence back to Washington. His movements, his habits, where he slept, what he ate, his daily routines. At the same time, Delta Force built a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound and trained on it repeatedly. They knew the layout of every room, every door, every escape route. Meanwhile, America's most advanced aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, swept into the Caribbean. An armada of warships surrounded Venezuela's coast. Trump later said he thought the naval buildup had gotten Maduro's attention. He wasn't wrong. Behind the scenes, panicked back-channel negotiations were taking place. In November 2025, Trump personally called Maduro on the phone. "You've got to surrender," Trump told him. "Leave the country. It would be in your best interest." According to CNN sources briefed on the call, it was described as pretty much an ultimatum. Maduro came close to giving in, Trump said later, but he stayed. It was the worst decision of his life. Trump approved the final operation before Christmas, from Mar-a-Lago. Then they waited. The moment came on the night of January 2nd, a break in bad weather over Caracas that gave U.S. aviators a clear path into the city. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time, Trump gave the order. What followed were 2 hours that changed history. More than 150 aircraft launched from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere. Bombers, fighter jets, electronic warfare planes, and the helicopters carrying the men who would grab Maduro. First, they hit Venezuela's air defenses. Explosions tore through Fort Tiuna, the country's largest military complex, in the heart of Caracas. Military installations across northern Venezuela lit up. The goal: clear the skies. Then the power went out. All of Caracas, dark. Trump later suggested the U.S. had cut the electricity to give the raid team an edge. The helicopters came in at 100 feet above the water, just above the surface, below radar. Chief Warrant Officer Eric Slover was piloting one of the Chinook helicopters. As his aircraft approached Maduro's compound, Venezuelan guards opened fire. Slover was hit by 4 bullets in the leg and the hip. His helicopter was also hit, but it stayed in the air. Despite his wounds, Slover kept control of the aircraft, got his Delta Force team over the compound, and allowed them to fast rope down to the ground. Then he flew back out to the USS Iwo Jima, waiting in the Caribbean. Trump later awarded him the Medal of Honor. On the ground, Delta Force breached Maduro's residence. Trump said he and his wife were taken completely by surprise. Both tried to run for the steel door of a safe room inside the compound. They didn't make it. By 1 a.m. Eastern Time, U.S. soldiers had Maduro and Cilia Flores in custody. The entire ground operation, minutes. Trump watched it all live from Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by generals. "I watched it literally like I was watching a television show," he said afterward. "The speed, the violence. It was an amazing thing." Within hours, photos emerged. Maduro on the deck of the USS Iwo Jima, in handcuffs, wearing a plain shirt. The White House reposted a video with the caption, "Perp walked." Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago. He declared it one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might in American history. Then he said something extraordinary. "We're going to run the country," he said, referring to Venezuela, "until we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition." The United States was now, apparently, in charge of Venezuela. The human cost was severe. Venezuelan officials confirmed over 100 people were killed, civilians and military. Cuba confirmed 32 of its nationals died in the attack, all part of Maduro's security detail. 7 U.S. service members were wounded. Caracas was a ghost city the next morning. Stores closed, streets empty, families in the outskirts picking through debris from exploded buildings. At the United Nations, Russia and China demanded Maduro's immediate release. The UN Secretary General called the operation a dangerous precedent. Across Latin America, the reaction was explosive. Colombia's president threatened to take up arms if the U.S. tried something similar there. Mexico's president said the Americas do not belong to any doctrine or any power. FARC guerrillas called for armed resistance across the region. On January 5, 2026, Nicolas Maduro, a sitting president of a sovereign nation, walked into a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan, in handcuffs, wearing orange prison slippers. He greeted people with, "Happy New Year." Then he introduced himself to the judge. "I am the president of Venezuela. I consider myself a prisoner of war. I was captured at my home in Caracas." His wife Cilia sat 2 seats away in matching prison clothes. Her right eye was swollen. Her forehead was bandaged. Injuries her lawyers said were sustained during the raid. His defense attorney, the same lawyer who had represented Julian Assange, argued that Maduro was the head of a sovereign state, immune from prosecution, and that there were serious questions about the legality of his military abduction. Both Maduro and Flores pleaded not guilty. As Maduro was led from the courtroom by U.S. Marshals, a man in the audience stood up and shouted at him in Spanish, calling him an illegitimate president. Maduro turned and looked directly at him. "I am a kidnapped president," he said. "I am a prisoner of war." What's happening in that Manhattan courtroom is genuinely unprecedented, and it raises questions legal scholars are still scrambling to answer. Can the United States kidnap a foreign head of state and put him on trial? Is that even legal? The Trump administration says yes, because Maduro was indicted on criminal charges. The operation was simply an arrest. Law enforcement, not war. International law experts say the operation almost certainly violated the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against another nation's sovereignty. Several argued it could only be legally justified as an act of war, which would have required congressional approval that Trump never sought. Democrats in Congress were furious. Senator Andy Kim wrote that Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth had looked every senator in the eye weeks earlier and said this wasn't about regime change and then blatantly lied. Then came another twist. The U.S. Treasury blocked Venezuela from paying for Maduro's legal defense. His lawyers argued this violated his Sixth Amendment right to counsel of his choice. In a remarkable move, the Treasury granted permission for Venezuela to cover his legal fees, then revoked that permission 3 hours later, without explanation. Maduro's team filed to have the entire case thrown out. On March 26th, Maduro and Flores appeared in Manhattan federal court for their second hearing. The judge refused to dismiss the case. But he signaled that the U.S. government's decision to block Venezuelan funds from covering Maduro's legal fees may be unconstitutional, and that court-appointed lawyers could not realistically handle a case of this complexity. No trial date has been set. The legal battle could take years. Senator Mark Warner asked it best the night of the operation. Does this mean any large country can indict the ruler of a smaller adjacent country and just take that person out? Let's be direct about something. Drug trafficking charges are the legal justification. But this story has always had another layer. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. 300 billion barrels. 17% of everything on Earth. Under Maduro, those reserves were largely off-limits to American companies. Venezuela sold its oil to China, Russia, Iran, anyone but the U.S. Now look at what happened after the raid. Trump openly said the U.S. would obtain access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves, and that Venezuelan oil revenue would pay for America's administration of the country. The new acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, who initially called the raid a barbaric kidnapping, quickly began meeting with U.S. officials and fast-tracking new oil and mining laws designed specifically to court Western corporations. On March 5th, the U.S. and Venezuela re-established full diplomatic relations for the first time in 7 years. Washington formally recognized Rodriguez as Venezuela's sole leader. The oil flows. Maduro sits in a Brooklyn jail. The country is now run by someone far more amenable to American business interests. Whatever you think of Maduro, and there is much to condemn, the question it raises is simple. Is this justice, or is this empire? In January 2026, the United States flew Delta Force into the capital of a sovereign nation in the middle of the night, blacked out the city, killed over 100 people, and flew its president out in handcuffs to face trial in New York. Whether you see that as justice finally catching up to a drug-dealing dictator, or as the most brazen act of American power projection in decades, one thing is undeniable. Nothing like it has ever happened before. And depending on what the courts decide, what Venezuela becomes, and how the world responds, it may define what is possible in international relations for the rest of this century. If you want to understand the world's most consequential stories, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.